All right, good morning, everyone. It is still morning, just thanks to our last speaker, ripping through there. My name's McDonald, I'm from the EMA, and for those of you that don't know what that means, that's the Employers and Manufacturers Association. And why would we be here? Well, we're very strong supporters of the work that Infrastructure New Zealand does in particular. We've worked very closely with the team on pushing for the National Infrastructure Commission, for example, and the work we've done with Infrastructure New Zealand, Property Council, and the Environmental Defence Society has been instrumental in finally getting that RMA review across the line. And Stephen Selwood's looking at me now saying, don't say you agree with it, Alan. And I won't, okay? So, good morning. We're going to talk a little bit today about decarbonising our transport network. And about 20% of our emissions come from transport. So how are we going to do that? How's that going to impact on our business environment? What are the alternatives that we can look at? All those sorts of things. And look, one of the important things for us with infrastructure is the impact that it has on both productivity and the communities that we work in. And if you want an example of infrastructure making a real difference to a community, I suggest you all go and visit Whakatane or Kawerau or Opotiki at the moment, where things are going off. They are building new motels down there. They are rebuilding old pubs and putting in new restaurants, new bars. They're rebuilding their waterfronts, and they're expecting an influx of about 7,000 people into a region that's historically performed very, very poorly. So infrastructure does make a huge difference. They're not quite sure where they're going to house those people, by the way. Hazard a guess at what a 3-bedroom house in Whakatane will set you back now. And unless you've got a 6 or a 7 in front of that number, you're completely wrong. So there's some real challenges coming out of that. And they're one of our more isolated community areas as well, which is why the transport hub at Kawerau for them is very, very critical. But all of that in their isolation and some of the other areas around the country, that's contributing to our growth in transport emissions. So we're here today to talk about, can we decarbonise by 2050? And I'll just get my panel to introduce themselves, starting with Liz Halsted from Arup.
Hi, I'm Liz Halsted from Arup. I lead the advisory services and energy services for New Zealand. We're really passionate about embedding sustainability and decarbonising infrastructure as a company, and for me personally, I've been involved with decarbonising transport for the last probably 15 years, where I was involved with the development of some of the first electric vehicle charging points in the UK, and also running rubbish trucks off used cooking oil, and also got involved quite heavily in hydrogen as well. So really excited to be here and part of this discussion.
Awesome.
Hi everyone, my name's Lewis Mills. I'm the Head of Public Policy for Uber in New Zealand. Uber's interested in decarbonisation and transport because of the nature of our business and the size of our network. We operate in 13 towns and cities in New Zealand, and we're quite a big player globally. Last year, Uber was moving 15 million people per day, which is more than all the passenger movements in the entire commercial aviation sector. So I should say that's come down a little bit in the last few months, but hoping we can come back. But what that means is that we do invest a lot of time and resource in figuring out what the future of transport looks like, and in particular, how you can reduce the carbon emissions and accelerate electrification. So that's our interest. Looking forward to talking more about it.
Murray.
Morena, Murray Sherwin. I'm the chair of the Productivity Commission, at least for another couple of months. The interest in this topic is pretty deep. It obviously runs right into productivity performance in New Zealand, which is always a challenge. But we also completed, as many of you will be aware, a piece of work 2 or 3 years ago on how to make an efficient transition from where we are to net zero emissions by 2050, and transport figures in that obviously substantially along with the other bits, but a topic which is deeply relevant to our economic performance and productivity performance.
And finally, Andrew.
Kia ora, everybody. I'm Andrew Caseley, the Chief Executive of ECA, the Energy Efficiency and Conservation Authority. We've been in existence for 20 years this year and had a traditional focus on energy efficiency, but one of our other statutory mandates is the promotion of renewable forms of energy, and hence our increasing focus on decarbonisation of the economy across both business, transport and our homes.
Thanks, panel. Starter for 10 here. We've got a target of 0 carbon by 2050. Is that doable? Is it too aggressive? We've seen Boris Johnson come out and say we're going to do away with the internal combustion engine in 9 years. That'll be an interesting challenge for the UK. But are those targets, that 0 target by 2050, is that doable? Is it feasible? What sort of impacts can we expect from that? Start with you, Andrew.
Look, I think the first point I'd make, Alan, is it's net zero. I think that's really important to recognise the fact that there will be some gross emissions that are part of our profile by 2050, as we've got it embedded in the legislation now. If we get on with it now, I think it is. But the point being, and the point that's been made over the last couple of days, is that we can't keep talking about the problem. We've got to start acting on the issues and taking the steps necessary to start reducing dramatically during the course of this next decade to hit our commitments under Paris by 2030, and then progressively make the progress necessary to 2050.
Murray, could you perhaps throw a productivity lens on that?
Sorry?
Could you throw a productivity lens on that? Because we're
Sure.
historically pretty rubbish at productivity in New Zealand.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you know, fossil fuels are just deeply embedded in modern economies and have been really since the beginnings of the steam engine and electricity and the internal combustion engine. So we're setting out to try and break a habit that we've had for the last 150 to 200 years, and which has really driven the living standards that we have now. And productivity's been an integral part of that, because we've obviously had a lot of productivity gains off the available transportation. I mean, productivity comes out of lots of people being able to exchange, being able to specialise in their production, and being able to shift stuff around and compete with each other. So it's an integral part of how you achieve productivity. The judgment that we came to in that work that we did was that achieving net zero by 2050 and maintaining living standards and productivity was achievable but challenging. And one of the points that came up when we were doing that work was that the challenge just grows over time. The sooner you start, the easier the transition, if you like, and you know, we're 2 or 3 years past that, and still nothing much has happened. Yes, we've got a climate change commission in place. We've got we've upgraded the ETS and all the rest of it, but we really haven't started to see the bite yet. And you know, time marches on.
Lewis, you move a few people around. Where do you see the challenges by net zero carbon in 2050?
Yeah. So I think, you know, for us, the sort of first line of defence, if you like, to trying to get there on the transport side is developing that range of modes all available on the app so that people can have the right mode for the right trip. So what I think that looks like is having your standard Uber ride, but it also means your pooling technology, so you're getting more people into fewer cars. It means access to micromobility, the dreaded scooters, but also the e-bikes. And in the longer term, it'll mean autonomous vehicles and the rest as well. So it's about building up that suite of options that are available, so you actually have a genuine alternative that can actually match your transport need and match every use case to get around, because it's really, really difficult, as we all know, to beat the convenience of having your own car. So it's a long-term project.
So Liz, you've been involved in shifting some of those behaviours. Are we starting too late? Are we not being aggressive enough? How are we going to get to that net zero 2050 target?
So I think it's quite interesting, just to follow up on what you also said about Boris and the UK being able to make those targets for 2030. It's because they've been doing a lot for quite a long time, including having plans and very strong targets. So that would be what I would say is we have been having a bit of hooey and not necessarily enough doughy. I think we've got to get on now and to a lot more action and having a really strong vision, which we've got, but now targets and a regulatory framework to support that, and a roadmap for how people can get there. But it's not just about government, it's not just about private sector, it's about all of us together. And it's about seeing how we can break it down from individuals right through to all organisations, so that everyone takes responsibility for it, because sometimes this might seem overwhelming, but once you start to break it down, it can become a lot more achievable. And if we don't believe it, it won't happen, but if we believe it will happen, it will.
All right, believing it's a bit of an issue, I think, because I've just been out on the road talking to our members. We do a round of briefings 3 times a year, and I've spoken to probably about 2,000 of our members during that round, and only one person asked me about zero emissions and the impacts of carbon. So, you know, for our guys, the SME side of the world, it's about what's it going to cost and what do I have to do to make that. So, Lewis, you come from a company that's seen an opportunity and had an impact on emissions. Where do you think the opportunities lie now? Where are the quick wins for us? And I'll pose that question to all of the panel.
Yeah, so I think there's a few bits that need to be done to get there. So on the rideshare side, and this applies to taxis, it applies really to any commercial passenger driving, and even more broadly to, you know, the guy who came to fix the dishwasher at our place, who drives around all day in his van, his diesel van, so quite high utilisation. We think to accelerate the electrification on those use cases, you need to get the infrastructure right, which means having enough of it. That's like step one, but also having it in the right place. So if you're a rideshare driver or a taxi driver, you really do, and you're a high kilometre user, you need the ability to be able to charge the vehicle overnight so you don't have tons of downtime during the day. And even in London, which has got quite developed charging infrastructure, we have a map at Uber which shows where all the chargers are. And if you live in Knightsbridge or Mayfair, so you're a fugitive oligarch or whoever lives there, then brilliant, you've got chargers galore. If you live in East London, there's hardly any. It's a little bit of a desert. And that's actually where Uber drivers, taxi drivers, you know, the man with the van, that's where they tend to live. So the infrastructure needs to be planned and designed in such a way as that it actually meets the requirement and meets the demand. And there are some good models of that in Amsterdam and other places where they've actually had a demand-driven approach. So that's one of the barriers, is just getting the infrastructure in the right place.
So Murray, perhaps on the infrastructure piece, where are we on that? Because we're not seeing anything coming through in the planning side, and we were talking earlier about, you know, new industrial land, for example, in Auckland will be at Papakura and Warkworth. There's no infrastructure in place to support the freight task, for example, around there. So where can we pick up the infrastructure argument to help boost the productivity while also reducing the emissions profile that we have with that freight fleet?
Yeah, so decarbonising transport is as much about the evolving shape of our cities and networks as the technology around the motive power of the vehicles and so forth. You know, we've got Alan Bollard in the audience, chair of the new Infrastructure Commission, and they'll be putting together a long list of projects and thinking about where they fit in, where the priorities are, I think coupled with some other recommendations that we've made that have been picked up also around spatial planning for our urban development, really important to put those two together so that we've got some reasonably well integrated view of where our future development's going to go, and getting the infrastructure at least planned and the corridors marked out at an early stage so that we can put all of that together. So, you know, it's a coordination issue, and then with the coordination comes, you know, the funding, the mechanisms, you know, there's a hell of a lot of work to be done, not just on the plans, but also the capacity to deliver this stuff efficiently. And that means contracts that work with providers and allow them to invest in training, invest in technology, and the capacity to do the work that needs to be done.
So Andrew, are we seeing that joined up thinking now?
Sorry.
Are we seeing that joined up thinking that Murray's just referred to in planning for the infrastructure and those other areas?
To a certain degree, but I want to go back to your initial question about, well, what do we need to do to make the progress? And certainly we recognise the need that, you know, city form is a critical thing, but that's not going to happen quickly. I mean, our cities are formed over decades, and so you're not going to change that quickly. So if we are to make the real progress which we need to at, say, cutting in half the emissions from our transport fleet over the next 10 years, there's two critical things I think have got to occur. You've got to look at what vehicles are coming in across the border and the quality of those. The quality of those from an emissions profile. And New Zealand still is one of the only few OECD countries that does not have a fuel economy standard. And consequently, the Europeans who have stated they have to have 95 grams per kilometre travelled of emissions, almost, I think it's now, ours still sit at 175. So that's the first thing that I think is critical. And if you didn't know, we still import around 300,000 new and used vehicles a year. Over the course of 10 years, 3 million vehicles would have come into the fleet, potentially suboptimal. So that's the first thing. The second one is the legacy of our existing fleet. About 4 million vehicles, almost all without exception running on diesel and petrol. And that is massively challenging because of the socio-economic impact of changing that quickly. But again, I think the things that we've got to look at there are where might biofuels play in a blend sense around what we put into our fuel tanks. For example, if we were able to get that equation right, you had a 10% blend of fuel that went into every tank, that would be 1.6 million tonnes of carbon you could offset immediately. So to me, those are the really important things, and it's the 80-20 rule. Where can we get 80% of the benefit with 20% of the resource requirement, whether cost or however defined?
Liz, do you want to just elaborate on that point, perhaps?
Yeah, I'd just like to, I guess, build on that, because also from overseas as well, some of the big challenges or the things, opportunities in terms of fuel economy savings and having a proper standard for that is really important. But the other thing that's been really transformational is an age limit to the vehicles. And I know that some people will get nervous about it, but that is when you start to actually make proper change. And unless we actually start to restrict the age of some of the vehicles coming into New Zealand, we potentially, as all of these countries around the world start to bring in tougher standards, we're going to be a receiver, almost a rubbish tip of these quite dirty vehicles. And I think just further to that as well, so we've talked about infrastructure and we've talked about land use, we've talked about vehicle standards, but one of the other really quick wins, one of the three things that I would say is infrastructure, promotion and information. And one of the other things that we need to do is actually make decarbonisation personal to people. And EECA's been doing a lot in terms of communicating to people about what decarbonisation means. But building on what Lewis said, we actually need to have data out there, not just for people who are in the industry. We need to have data that's available and simple for people to understand what they personally need to do to reduce emissions from their transport as well, and then linking it back to targets, whether it's how they use their vehicle, like eco-driving, or what vehicle they purchase next, or actually getting into public transport and walking.
So Andrew and Liz, you both touched on a point that I think is a difficult point we need to cover off in here, and that's the social impact of some of the measures you're talking about. Because we do have an ageing fleet, one of the reasons we have that is because a large number of people hang on to their vehicles because they are economically challenged and they tend to live in our poorer communities. So how do we encourage them with, is it fee baits, which tend to subsidise, as Lewis's point earlier, all the electric vehicle points in London are in Knightsbridge. So it's the wealthier part of the economy that picks up these things earlier. How do we shift that social dial and the socio-economic dial as well? How do we encourage those people? How do we get them? How do we look after them if we force something on them, like the policy changes that I've seen earlier referred to? Because they can't cope with that change. Yeah. How do we do that?
Look, that's an absolutely relevant and critical factor, and the government has said that our movement to a low emissions economy has got to be a just transition. I mean, that's hugely challenging. And I think anybody who lived through the dramatic economic changes in New Zealand's history in the 80s understands how difficult that is and the consequences if you don't get that right or do your best around that. So totally get it. But my way of thinking at the moment is we have such a low penetration rate of low emission vehicles coming into our fleet But that's not the challenge yet. I think the challenge is to get more meaningful numbers into the fleet initially, and they will trickle down, as Richard referenced in the last presentation, through the various grades of vehicle users and the price points that they can afford. So let's get more in at the top with the people that can afford it, and let it trickle down, and let's hope that the technology and the price point is going to change as is predicted in the timeframes that they're saying.
So anecdotally, since we're sitting in West Auckland, the fastest growing sales for second-hand vehicles in West Auckland is a Nissan Leaf.
That's fantastic, long may it last. But I can tell you straight away that EV sales in Japan are diminishing. So supply out of Japan of Nissan Leafs is going to get tighter and tighter, and more countries, in addition to New Zealand, are hunting them. So that isn't our long-term solution either, but it nevertheless is great news, Alan.
Anyone else want to pick that up?
I was just going to say that, yeah, so one of the barriers is definitely vehicle availability. New Zealand is a small market compared to the rest of the world. Often we get lumped in with Australia as well, who are even slower than us in terms of decarbonising their transport because of their big reliance on coal. But I think in terms of your question about social impact, the other thing, and it comes back to what Murray was saying in terms of land use, is when we're also building affordable housing, Kāinga Ora building their housing developments, is we also look at offering alternatives and putting electric car shares and things where people can try things out, but also working with the car manufacturers and the second-hand car manufacturers to start to see how we can penetrate, and also give people the understanding of, once you buy an electric or low-emission vehicle, what your savings can be on a day-to-day basis as well. And there's a lot of applications coming through the contestable fund now that are starting to look at how do we start to reach out to these socio-economic, low socio-economic groups.
Yeah. So Lewis, given our relatively poor public transport penetration in networks, do you see perhaps an opportunity, or is Uber an alternative in there to help those lower socio-economic people in that transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think a way to think about it, if you sort of step back from the vehicle ownership question, is, well, is the future going to be everybody just still owns a car, but it's now an EV? So we just do a swap for EVs. And I think Uber would say that, well, that's probably not the way things are going to work. There needs to be a range of different options available to meet the different needs. And the private car, including your EV sitting there in traffic, because still going to be traffic, even with EVs, unfortunately, isn't going to be the way of the future. And I think, you know, what we say about car share and stuff like that, having a range of different modes available, so we're not always funneled and forced into the choice of taking a private car and having the luxury of sitting in that by yourself. You also need a bit of a cultural shift and say, hey, look, you know, there's pooling technology out there which Uber uses in other parts of the world, gets more people into fewer cars. There's micromobility, there's car share operated by some companies in New Zealand. And I think that we have to find a way of those range of modes, and private car ownership and EV is one of them. But those range of modes has to be available, and they have to be seamless and usable for people.
Murray?
Yeah, wherever we end up, it has to be convenient and usable for people. You know, it's got to be a preferred mode of transport, whether it's transport as a service, whether it's owning your own, whether it's public transport. So, you know, usability, convenience, price, all matter. What I would say about, you know, whether it's EVs or hydrogen vehicles or whatever, all of those technologies tend to start out expensive and a bit clunky to use. They get better over time. I mean, the technology on battery seems to be emerging pretty rapidly, maybe hydrogen as well. But to get it started, and to come back to a point that Andrew was making, the average age of our vehicles at scrappage is close to 20 years. So for a 2050 target, you really need to have most of your new vehicles at low emissions by 2030, not far away. I think the fee-bate type scheme which we were recommending still stands as a pretty good one, and some emission standards as well. And recognising that for low-income New Zealanders, the advent of used imports was probably the biggest single step in well-being for them in terms of giving them mobility, at affordable mobility, in years when that first came through. So, you know, we've got this tricky transitional issues in there which relate to, providing low-cost and effective transport for those groups.
All right. Just a couple of questions that have come through on Slido. So, and they're related, I think, to the charging network in particular. So, is the future of charging, is it in the home? And given that the bulk of our transport costs or emissions are actually coming from the freight sector, I think the answer is possibly no, but I'll be interested in your views. And then who should own or run the vehicle charging network in New Zealand if we have an extensive national network? We'll start with you, Andrew.
I'll go. Look, I think we were out the back, but I'm pretty sure that Richard covered that in the previous presentation, is that in charging, to avoid the significant potential cost in upgrading both, or certainly the local distribution network, is that home charging is totally sensible where that is feasible, and we know that it's not. But about 80%, I think, of New Zealand homes do have some sort of off-street parking where it can be an achievable objective, and that is our strong encouragement that that occurs. And also, the time of charging is fundamental. So that reference to smart chargers, I think, is going to be critically important to minimise the investment in the distribution network that we required there. In terms of public charging, I think we've been extremely lucky in New Zealand to date that Steve West, who is the principal shareholder in ChargeNet, has been prepared to put a significant amount of his own personal capital and funds into the rollout of a national charging network, supported by the government's low emission vehicle contestable fund. And I'm sure that as uptake of EVs increases, that there will be more players in that market. I mean, I cannot imagine that it will remain a sort of predominant provider scenario as it is now. And I think the combination between predominantly home charging, but with an adequate public charging network, that we will have what we need.
So there's been a lot of talk about the electric side of things, Murray. Is that a feasible alternative for that freight task?
Sorry, the echoes here are awful. I can't.
Okay, sorry. So there's been a lot of talk about the electric charging network, and Andrew's focus probably on residential, but are EVs a viable alternative for the freight task and the productivity we need out of that?
Well, my reading on this is that probably yes, a lot of the freight task is in a city. It's transporting stuff around the city, and there's already vehicles available to do that, and I'm sure we're going to see a whole lot more of it. The long-haul task, which is relatively smaller, might be a bit different, and Elon Musk will tell you that he's got it sussed, along with a couple of others, some of whom might end up in jail. One of those technologies, we try to be technology neutral in our work, so whether it's hydrogen or electricity or something else magical comes along, who knows. A little way off yet, though, I think. But given that, as I said, most of the freight task is around cities, I would have thought electricity could well do the trick.
Liz, maybe if I could come to you on that, because you've been working with some of those alternative fuels. And also maybe, are there some examples? New Zealand's quite good as being a magpie and picking up overseas examples and applying them here, and we won't do anything here until we've compared ourselves to overseas anyway. Could you give us maybe a couple of real-world examples of where it has worked?
So in terms of, I do think the point that Murray made about freight is really important, and I think we probably don't talk about it enough, about the servicing and delivery in the first and last leg versus I guess the long haul kind of freight. And in terms of what Murray was saying about the first and last leg, there's a definite opportunity there for electrification, but also looking at other alternatives like cycle or cargo freight for inner city first and last leg, and really looking at different things in terms of freight consolidation. So there's been examples over in the UK and Europe where they've actually used cycle freight to actually stop a lot of those smaller journeys, and then also working with a lot of the small last mile van deliveries, like Amazon causes a lot of the congestion in a lot of cities around the world with their deliveries, and just working with them on their vans. Amazon, for example, use hydrogen for all their forklifts, but electric for their sort of short distance freight. They're looking at drones at the moment as well, and there's testing of drones for small first and last leg delivery on things. For the longer haul freight, the jury is out. There's a lot of, as Murray said, there's a lot of different players in the market about looking at electric. There's also biomethane, biofuels for the heavy vehicles, but there's also hydrogen. And there's things going on in New Zealand, but also globally, with both electric freight vehicles, but also hydrogen. And my view is in terms of heavy freight and what we're seeing globally. I lead our global low emission mobility work for our company, is we're seeing heavy freight, and a lot of the big freight operators globally, long haul, are looking towards hydrogen, but the problem is vehicle availability and cost.
Right, so where are we going to get the electricity to make that hydrogen?
Yeah, and it depends on the type of hydrogen as well, because you've got byproduct from the oil and gas industry that hydrogen's created from, or you create it through electrolysis, through solar and wind. And over in Australia and the Middle East and places like that, they are able to have a lot of solar power in the desert, for example, in Saudi Arabia, and they're then using electrolysis to create the hydrogen. But that's a challenge in New Zealand. So
you mentioned byproducts there, Murray. I've got one for you, probably. What do we do with all those dead batteries?
Yeah, look, it's probably not surprising, but it does periodically surprise me just how many people do raise the issue of afterlife of batteries out of battery electric vehicles. And one of the things that I quote back to people is the research that's gone on globally, particularly out of the Scandinavian countries. And I know that the Finns have worked out that they can recycle 85% of a battery out of an electric vehicle. And the other comment that I would make in conjunction with that is I absolutely get the importance of being able to recycle things like batteries. It is fundamentally important, but I don't think that should act as a barrier for us to make the progress around a low emission alternative either, because if we keep putting barriers up to what our solutions to our emissions challenge, and let's bring it back to what it's all about, it is to try and reduce the impact of global warming, then we've got a real problem, I think. So there's a few areas where I think we just need to back ourselves that the right result will occur. And already we're seeing the repurposing of battery electric vehicles or batteries for example, power walls in homes. And I mean, that's a proven reuse scenario right now.
All right. Another question that's come off Slido, and it's related to a couple of the topics we were talking about earlier, is what are the incentives for business in particular to push through and electrify their fleets or use alternative fuels? What incentives are available to us? And maybe not just incentives, what are some of the other gains for business, let's put it that way, rather than a fee-based scheme or direct subsidy or however you want to put it. So what are the gains, what are the opportunities? And maybe I'll start with you on that one, Lewis, just to throw you in the deep end there, mate.
Yeah. So I mean, for Uber's committed to zero emissions, so true zero tailpipe emissions in the US and Europe 2030, and then the next markets to follow in the next couple of years after that. And the reason you have to do that is because otherwise we'll just globally fail to meet the obligations, and because if you're a big operator, you just need to be responsible and part of the solution. I think it's going to take, it takes a lot to, because at the moment the interim cost gap between your internal combustion engine and your EV is so massive, and the second-hand market hasn't quite reached a point where it can really substitute it. It does take a bit of explaining about, well, why would you do this? I think beyond just being responsible, consumers are also demanding it. So on the passenger service side of things, Uber is increasingly in other parts of the world making a point of having an EV available specifically. So you actually are getting that real consumer-driven focus on, it's called Uber Green, where you pay an extra $1 and an EV turns up, rather than an internal combustion engine, which is what you'll still get in most parts of the world. So I think that it's taking on the responsibilities of business, but consumers are going to demand it, and at some point soon it just won't be good enough for the demographic that's using Uber and the various other innovations that are connected to Uber.
Murray?
Look, I'm not an expert on the range of incentives and other subsidies and so forth that are out there already, but I'm sure we'll see a few more at various stages to try and expedite the transition. One of the observations I would make, though, is in the time, 3 or 4 years that we've been looking at this stuff, my sense is that senior executives and board members in New Zealand's companies have really shifted their mindset a long way on this stuff. There's a sense of social responsibility and built very deeply into a lot of these people. It's a sort of a younger generation of business managers who've come along, and that's you know, from the discussions I have around town. So we've shifted a long way, and they want to do that because they, you know, worry about the world that their kids and their grandkids are going to come into, and that's entirely appropriate.
Andrew, you've been working on some of these sort of incentives and gains for a long period now. Where do you see things working? What can and can't work there? How do you shift that mindset?
Yeah, look, our involvement in that space has been at a modest level, and it was all about just trialling and demonstrating and risk sharing around the use of that low emission vehicle contestable fund that's been in place for almost 4 years now. Just quickly, the numbers, about $27 million worth of projects approved, about 170 in total. And I think for the purpose that it was intended to achieve, it's done extremely well, because it has shown that the use of battery electric vehicles in particular, which is what it's almost wholly being used for, has proven the use applications. Aside from that, there really are no direct incentives in terms of subsidies for anybody to pick up battery electric in particular, and yet we still have seen many corporates doing it. They've done it for brand reasons, that they have a very strong sustainability platform of which they see their emissions reductions and their transport usage as part of that. But the other thing too is that increasingly, you made the reference before to Nissan Leafs, second-hand Nissan Leafs. I mean, they do have a very positive economic scenario around them already. Now, not everybody wants to use a second-hand Nissan Leaf, but you know, I think there's evidence now because of the lower cost of the fuel, namely the electricity, the much lower maintenance cost, the advantage you're getting from road user charges, albeit I can't see that that's going to last forever as the numbers increase in terms of usage. But the economics are already there. And the really interesting thing, and I was blown away by this, is that the managing director of Alsco believes that that mid-freight truck that was converted with the use of the contestable fund, but even if you didn't have that subsidy there, in his view, is economic now. Now, if that is the case, there really is no reason for a lot of larger users of that mid-freight range vehicle, if they can get over the capital cost issue, to adopt that technology. So, you know, I think that's a very positive thing, and we need to highlight that more.
Just to add to that, if I could.
Sure.
I think Andrew makes an important point that the ultimate incentive at the end of the day is the economics of the stuff. You know, how does this play out? And it's striking, looking at the US, for instance, that coal-fired electricity has been declining, even notwithstanding the strenuous efforts of Donald Trump and his mates. And that's just the economics of solar and wind have begun to roll over the economics of generating from coal in a lot of places, and I think we'll see more of that. And you know, these things matter.
So, yeah, just going back to, following on from all of this, but going back to the question as well, is one of the other things you can do, and this is what we're seeing both in New Zealand but also globally as well, is not just looking for incentives, but actually in terms of money, looking at your fleet, because what we're finding is that actually a lot of fleets that have been historically there, been offered to people that you'll have a car as part of your job, but actually a lot of them are just sitting in these car parks around New Zealand, not necessarily being used. So what we're finding is not only that people are looking to decarbonise their fleet, but they're actually looking at are these vehicles all being utilised, or are there other things that could be done? So is it offering some public transport as part of your package for your work, but can you reduce some of your fleet numbers? And then what is the roadmap to get going to electric for your fleet? And then just working through backwards on that. And what is interesting, once you start the conversation, is there's often quite a lot of savings that can be made, which really make a big difference to people as well.
So I'm just very conscious that we're in the second worst time slot ever for a conference. You don't want to be between a crowd and a lunch, and you don't want to be between a crowd and a beer. So it's nearly lunchtime. There's one final, or two final related questions that have come through on Slido, and they both refer, one is to the leadership role that NZTA can play in this, and one says, what's the EMA doing about getting its small business members involved on taking emissions seriously? And we do, and we are. But that's not a question just for us two organisations. I mean, MOT's here, Auckland Transport's here, Auckland Council is here, Wellington Council's here. And the solutions in the planning and the infrastructure and the funding and the provision and the education, and that's the role I think is beholden for all of us in those advocacy type or community-facing organisations. That's something that we've got to do and take on as our role to push forward to get the action we need to hit those 2050 targets if we're going to hit them. So thanks everyone. It's lunchtime. Enjoy the break.